Hi, I'm Saskia van Nouhuijs, and I'm a professor of ecology at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. And today's lecture is going to be about parasitism and infectious diseases. So, the topics that I'm going to cover are definitions of what is a parasite and a pathogen, what's a disease as opposed to an infectious disease, factors that influence the severity of infections at the level of populations and at the level of individuals, and these includes the rate of transmission. And then I'll give an example of how these factors are relevant for a set of plant pathogens. Then I'll talk briefly about evolution and coevolution between hosts and pathogens, and I'll talk briefly about zoonotic diseases. So in previous lectures, we've talked about species interactions in communities. And so parasite pathogen is kind of like a predator-prey interaction in the sense that it's positive for the pathogen or the parasite and negative for the host. But the parasites and pathogens are much smaller than the hosts. And when we think about sort of a community or a food web, we often draw all the different organisms that are in the food web, and we should remember to superimpose on that all of the pathogens and parasites that are in all of the species. So in any of these species, not just the ones that I have arrows pointing to, there are also pathogens and parasites that are affecting the fitness of those individuals and their rate of reproduction and things, just like the other types of interactions. Okay, so we've covered competition, negative-negative, and predation, positive-negative, which is also like parasitism. And then we will later be covering mutualism, positive interactions between species, and facilitation. All right, so I'm just going to start with definitions. So a parasite. A parasite is an organism that lives in or on another organism, which we call the host, and it gets its nutrients from it, so it lives off the host, and it reduces the fitness of the host or kills it. And it may live in or on the host, and it may or may not reproduce in or on the host. So in this picture we see some ticks, lice, and fleas. These are large parasites. We see aphids on a plant. We can think about some kinds of herbivores, especially herbivorous insects that live on a plant as parasites, and we see a parasitoid wasp and a host beetle. Okay, so we divide parasites into different categories. So macroparasites, or meaning big, are often arthropods such as fleas or mosquitoes or ticks, or they're other kinds of sort of organisms that are big enough that you can see them, and they usually don't multiply within their host. So they may reproduce within their host, but they don't have multiple generations within a host. Versus microparasites, which are what we think of when we say pathogen usually. So a microparasite is something that's very small, and a pathogen or an infectious disease. So that might be a bacteria or a protozoan. And these ones do multiply within their definitive host, meaning that they have a population that grows at some rate within the host. So over time, the number within a host increases. Versus most macroparasites, that's not what happens. And then there's this third category, which is herbivores insect herbivores as parasites. And so that's when one individual gets all or almost all of its food from a single host individual, then it functions like a parasite. Versus other kinds of herbivores, say a cow, which eats many host individuals in a bite, or something that's a predator, which also eats many individuals over its lifetime. So if an organism is just eating one individual or less than one individual in its lifetime, then we would call it a parasite. Okay, so we certainly associate the word parasite with the word disease. But it's important to remember that there's two different types of diseases. So in general, a disease is some harmful condition that a body is in that affects its normal structure or its function, and that's not due to an injury. So if you fall down and sprain your ankle, you don't have a sick ankle, you have a hurt ankle. Okay, and so a disease is just a poorly functioning body. A diseased body is poorly functioning, and that disease can be infectious or not infectious. So when we talk about pathogens, we're talking about organisms that cause a disease in another organism, and those are infectious. So there are many diseases that organisms have that are not infectious, that are not due to pathogens, and they're not infectious, such as most cancers. So this is a picture of a brain tumor, and so this is a disease that a human has, but it's not due to a pathogen for the most part. Okay. In contrast are infectious diseases. So in the same thing, it's a harmful condition that affects the structure directly or not directly due to injury, but it's due to a pathogen that is spread among hosts. And if we think of pathogens, then usually we think of microorganisms or other sort of organisms or things like organisms, and such as a parasitic worm, a fungus, a prokaryote, and then virus and a prion, which we may or may not think of as organisms. I guess we don't think of a prion as organisms, but it's a protein sort of arrangement which acts as an infectious disease. Okay, so these are the types of things that are pathogens. Now, pathogens have to get from one host to another. So a pathogen infects a host, and it uses that host for its nutrients. So over time, it'll use up that host, right? So it has to say live and multiply, and the population of the pathogen increases within the host, and then it has to somehow get into another host in order to then use that host as the resource. And so there's various different modes of transmission of the pathogen from one host to another. And so the ones we think about often are through air, such as we sneeze when we have a flu, and we will transmit the disease to somebody else. Through water, lots of waterborne infectious diseases. Through bodily fluids, and then through vectors. And so a mosquito is a vector of diseases. So it's a vector when it's a vector of diseases among host individuals that it chooses to feed on. And we actually can think of a mosquito as itself a parasite. And then we can also think of it as important for disease because it vectors other diseases so it carries other diseases from one host to another. So a vector is a living organism, but it has the disease in it, but it doesn't get sick with the disease. So it has the disease in some form that's not reproducing, and it's carried between and it carries the disease between hosts. So in this case, a mosquito can bite, can pierce one host as it's feeding, and then while it's feeding, the pathogen, which is in the bloodstream of the host, can get into the mosquito. So say malaria or dengue. The mosquito can carry that, and then the next host that it lands on and it pierces, some of its saliva may have the pathogen in it, and that way it's transmitting the pathogen. Okay, so all of these vectors, air, water fluids, and animals, all of these modes of transmission are all extremely common. There's many examples of diseases that use these various different methods. Another kind of transmission of disease, of communicable disease, is vertical transmission. And by vertical, we mean from the parent to the offspring. I guess from the mother to the offspring. So these top ones are called horizontal transmission because they just go from individual to individual, not along a lineage. But some diseases are transmitted from the mother to the offspring. For example, HIV can be, but is not necessarily, so HIV is a virus, and it can be transmitted from the mother to the baby during birth. So while the baby is developing, it's shielded from the viral infection that the mother might have. But during the birth process, there's a period of time where where it's not shielded and has direct interaction with the viral particles in the mother's blood, and it can get the virus. And so that's another sort of mode of transmission. So there's how is it transmitted from host to host. And then if we think about like the severity of the disease for a population, there's the rate of transmission. And so that means sort of how quickly, how easily, does it move, does it spread within a host population? And the rate of transmission, as you can imagine, depends on the mode. Is it through the air, through the water, through body fluids? How sturdy the virus or the pathogen is in the external environment. So many diseases, many viruses say, are not very hardy to living outside of the body. And so there's how well it can persist between hosts affects the rate of transmission. And then also the rate of transmission, of course, is affected by how frequent it is in the population. So if there's a lot of individuals in the population who are infected, then the sort of rate of infection of new individuals is going to be high. So we talked about the transmission of a infection in a host population. And the other thing that's really important for us to think about is the sort of severity of the disease, both within the host population and within an individual. And so this sort of vague term, severity of the disease, we call the virulence. And how we define virulence depends on what field that we're in. So there's many different definitions of the word virulence. So for example, somebody who studies epidemiology is thinking at the population level, and they talk about virulence as something about the rate of movement between hosts. But somebody who's studying the immunology might talk about the amount of damage that a parasite can do within a host, within a single host. So I'm going to give you 4 different sort of definitions of virulence, and they're all interrelated. So the first is the degree of damage caused to a host. So this reminds me that when we talk about the damage that a disease does to a host, some diseases kill hosts, and some diseases just make them sick. And so the virulence is measuring, in this definition, the virulence is measuring how sick does it make a host. Another way to think of virulence is how easily can it infect a host. So this is sort of thinking of the something about the rate of transmission and then the susceptibility of the host at the very beginning to acquire the pathogen. Another measure of virulence, or definition of virulence that people use, is the rate that a host dies. So this is taking a disease which causes death, and a disease. And so if an individual dies within 4 days, it's very virulent. If an individual lives for 30 years, but eventually dies of the disease, then it's less virulent. Another sort of more clinical way of defining virulence is the rate of disease replication of the disease within the host. Okay. So when we think about this, we wonder why be a parasite? Why hurt the host? So think if a pathogen is extremely virulent, it has a big negative effect on the host, and in fact it kills it. And then once it kills the host, it doesn't have that host anymore. And so you think, okay, actually it might be better to not kill the host. So you can think about two aspects of this. So if the virulence is very high, the parasite kills the host quickly and doesn't manage to be transmitted to another host individual. But the virulence is low, then it's not using very many of the resources that are available in the host because it's reproducing slowly. And in fact, it might even be weak in competition, say, with other pathogens that might enter the host because it has a slow rate of reproduction. So we think, when we're thinking about sort of the evolution of virulence of diseases, that a parasite should evolve to be just as virulent, to be as virulent as it can be, meaning uses resources as much as it can, and still have the host live long enough that it can reliably transmit from one host to another. So the rate of virulence can be a very highly evolved sort of trait that is tailored to certain kinds of hosts with certain kinds of life history traits. Okay, so now that we've talked about sort of the interplay of different factors in the severity of disease, I'm going to do a quick little case study. So this is the looking at the fungal infection of two different tree species. And these tree species are the American chestnut and the American elm. And they're both became infected by an invasive fungal disease, and then the outcomes of them are much different. Okay, so we're going to start with the chestnut. So a long time ago, the American chestnut was a dominant part of the eastern North American forests. In fact, 1 out of every forest tree in the forested area was an American chestnut. And so it was a really important dominant tree in the forest. They have these big nuts, which are the food for lots of animals and also humans. And they make high quality wood, which people use for building. When the chestnut blight, which is a fungal infection, came accidentally from Asia in 1904, it had a huge effect. And in fact, between 1904 and 1950, almost every single American chestnut tree died from this fungal infection. So that's a humongous epidemic of the fungal disease. Okay. In contrast, the American elm was also a pretty dominant forest tree, and also one that had been planted in many cities. So it's an urban tree that was planted all over. And Dutch elm disease, which is another fungus, arrived in logs that were shipped from Europe in 1930. And a lot of trees were killed. But the American elm is still around. It's still an urban plant that people plant in cities, and it's still in the forest. So it's managed to stay around sort of just ahead of the Dutch elm disease. And so both the disease and the tree are still around, but the chestnut is gone. Okay, so there's similar fungal parasites, but why has the chestnut disappeared, but the elm has persisted? So let's think about the natural history of the system and get some clues. So first we'll think about what is the vector of the disease. So for the elm, this is the one that has not died off, the vector is a beetle. So the fungus gets on the beetle and the beetle walks from tree to tree. Okay. And in the chestnut, the fungus is spread in the air. The fungal spores are spread in the air, or they're spread by water, by rain. So they're spread by the air and the rain. So beetles spread the disease much slower than air and water do. Okay. So what about the life history of the tree? So elm trees grow pretty fast, and they produce seeds when they are still pretty. It only takes a few years before they start producing seeds, and these seeds are dispersed by wind. So so we can think, okay, the beetle is slow, which is transmitting the disease, and the tree is fast. And so the transmission of the disease is slow relative to the reproductive rate of the tree and how far the tree seeds can disperse. Meaning that since the seeds are blown by the wind, they can be blown out of the range of the beetles from an infected tree. So that's the elm. So the elm, trees grow fast, the disease is transmitted slow. Okay, what about the life history of the chestnut tree? So the chestnut tree grows very slowly. It doesn't produce seeds until it's been around for like 30 years. And these seeds are big, and they're dispersed by animals, and they aren't dispersed very far. Okay, so remember, this one is the fungus. In the case of the chestnut, the fungus transmits very fast in the water and the air, and the tree, on the other hand, disperses slowly and also reproduces very slowly. So it's sort of the opposite situation as the elm. Okay, so we asked the question, similar fungal parasites, why has the chestnut disappeared but the elm has persisted? And this is because the chestnut transmission of the disease is very fast all throughout the forest. And then the trees reproduce very slowly, so that disease kills everything off before new ones can become mature. Versus the elm, which is transmitted slowly by beetles who walk around not very far, and the trees can reproduce fast, and the trees can disperse quickly. And so this is the sort of ecological explanation why two very similar funguses have had a really different effect on the forest landscape where these trees grow. This is a new topic. So when we think about disease, I guess infectious disease, we think about evolution. So a disease has some virulence, and then the host has some way to fight off the disease. So it has its immunity. And you can imagine that it's to a host is at an advantage if it develops immunity to the disease, and the disease is at an advantage if it develops virulence against the host. And so they are imposing selection on each other, and it's very strong selection in most cases. So we say that there's an evolutionary arms race between the pathogen and the host. One is defending itself and one is attacking, and they keep evolving different mechanisms to sort of evade one another. So these kinds of coevolutionary arms races can lead to very specialized relationships between species, and which explains why not all hosts are susceptible to the same diseases. So there's many different diseases of many different organisms out there, and different species of hosts get different diseases, right? So we don't get the same diseases as shrimp get, and we don't even get most of the same diseases that monkeys get, although there is some overlap. And so different species carry different disease species. And this is due to this very close sort of give and take coevolutionary arms race between the host and the parasite. And this kind of a relationship can lead to extreme specialization, as I mentioned. And at any one moment, it could sort of seem like one species has the upper hand, at least in some respects, over the other species. And so I would like to just highlight one example where the parasite seems to be doing a really good job. So, and this is a parasitic, this is a caterpillar here. And then under here are the pupae of some parasitic wasps. So the parasitic wasps develop in the caterpillar, and then they came out and they pupated under the caterpillar. Okay, so they were pretty successful in that she lay eggs, she evaded the immune system of the host, so much so that she had all of these offspring, and the offspring came out and pupated. And then she went on to protect, and then the parasite went on to protect itself some more. So this caterpillar, while it's functionally dead, it can't move around and eat, it still is able to, it can't transport itself and eat. It still has part of its nervous system functional, and so it stays on top of these parasitic wasp pupae and protects them from being parasitized or eaten by predators themselves. So this parasite has not only successfully developed to pupation inside of the host, but then it also uses the host body in order to protect itself against being parasitized or eaten by predators. So super specialized behavior. All right. So then the last topic that I just want to mention briefly is the relationship of diseases of humans with diseases of other animals. And so when there's the spread of a disease either from other animals to humans or from humans to other animals, both of those occur, we call that a zoonotic disease. And we pretty much anywhere where there's overlap or where humans and animals are interacting, there's the chance of spreading disease among them. So for example, humans of course interact with their domestic animals as they're taking care of them, and so they can transmit diseases to each other if the disease has the chance. There's farming of wildlife, there's hunting of wildlife, and then there's some consuming wildlife as food. And so we have various interactions with wildlife. Now, of course, for the most part, the diseases that different species have humans are not susceptible to most of the diseases that other species have, but there are examples, of course, of when that there is transfer of the disease. And so usually that's when there's been some evolution either of the disease or of the vector. So for let's just say it's evolution of the disease. So say avian flu. So avian flu comes from birds, and human beings very occasionally can get avian flu. But avian flu has been evolving to be more virulent or to be better at infecting human hosts over time. So if there's evolution of a disease, then it can transfer between humans and other animals easily. And so there's various different reasons that zoonotic diseases are globally are kind of increasing. And so one of these reasons is that there's more human wildlife and also domestic animal wildlife human interactions that are going on as the population gets larger. And then also that there's the spread of disease vectors globally. And the spread of disease vectors globally is sort of for two reasons. So one of them is that there's more movement of human beings are moving organisms around with them intentionally and unintentionally. And then also because as the climate changes, both diseases and also vectors of diseases can live in habitats which they haven't been able to live in before. So the rate of zoonotic diseases is increasing over time. Now, zoonotic diseases are kind of confusing or complicated because there can be disease which within the normal host is not particularly virulent, but when it goes to a new host, it can be very virulent because the new host has not evolved immunity to it. But then when it goes to that new host, it may not be able so the new host has not evolved immunity to it, so it's super vulnerable. On the other hand, it may also be that a disease can go to a new host, but it's not able to reproduce and transmit to another host from that new host. So for example, if we think about tick-borne diseases, tick-borne diseases are carried by ticks from one host to another. And so for example, it can go from deer to cows to goats to sheep and to people. But people are considered a dead-end host for this because it's rare. Technically, you could go get an infection from person to person, but the vast majority of the infections are from ticks that went from animals to other people, and rarely does it go from a tick that bites a person and then goes on to another person. And so if we can think about the pools of diseases that are sort of living in different classes of organisms with varying degrees of competence to move among different species. And these varying degrees of competence are sort of changing as the global environment has changed. Okay. All right. So just to cap it off, I talked about hosts and parasites as one category of species interactions, and it's one category of plus-minus species interaction, resource consumer type of an interaction. And then I defined terms that people use around when they talk about parasites. So what is a parasite? What's a disease? What's an infectious disease? What's a pathogen? And then I talked about some of the factors that affect the severity of infection, both at the level of individuals and at the levels of populations. And that has a lot to do with the virulence and the transmission rate and the mode of transmission of the disease. I gave an example of two different plant pathogenic fungi that infect trees, and then we talked about sort of the mechanisms by which it's a sort of a lethal infection at the population level for the chestnut tree, but for the elm tree, the disease and the elm trees persist over time in the environment. I talked briefly about evolution and co-evolution in a host-disease interaction, which they have a very strong evolutionary association with each other. And then also very briefly about zoonotic diseases and the reasons that zoonotic diseases are increasing globally over time. And that's all for today. Thank you.